4 from Montclair State, so let's give him a warm welcome again. Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see all of you here, and I see a lot of familiar faces, people that have been here before when I've spoken. Today's topic is the United States deal with the Iranian regime regarding the nuclear program that Iran has. And nominally, today's talk is entitled U.S. Foreign Policy, Current Issues, but I was going to talk at great length about the Iran deal. If we have time, I'll address some other issues that have nothing to do with Iran, but if we don't, I'll certainly open the floor up for some questions or discussion, because I know that this is a topic that is of great interest. It was described to me as something that is of great interest to the residents here, and so I certainly want to give enough time to talk about it at length.
You can always come back tomorrow.
Sure. Well, this is a deal that was reached this summer that is the product of many years of negotiation, both informal and formal, between the United States and other nations, including what is called the P5+1. That means the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus one non-permanent member. The permanent members are, of course, the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia. And the non-permanent member, that's the +1, is Germany. Those 6 nations were in negotiation with the Iranian government, and the agreement that they reached was between the negotiators was finalized this summer, but as you know, coming up in September, there will be a formal vote taken in the U.S. Congress about what the U.S. Congress plans to do in terms of this agreement, and I'll talk about that at greater length later. The first thing I'd like to do is address some of the particulars of the agreement itself. So the basics of it. In order to make a nuclear bomb, you can do it 2 different ways. One way is to enrich uranium, and you do it through these centrifuges. And these are little machines that spin really fast to take all of the impurities out of the uranium. They spin really quickly and they enrich it, meaning they get a much purer form of uranium. You need to have 90+% purity in order to have a nuclear bomb. You can have less purity in order to run a civilian nuclear program. And currently, Iran has 12 tons of enriched uranium. That's enough for several bombs. And under this agreement, they have agreed to reduce the amount of enriched uranium to about 660 pounds. That's not enough to make one nuclear bomb. And so they're going to reduce it by a great amount, about 98%, in other words, of what they've already made, they're going to reduce. This is what they pledged to do. Whether they'll follow through with it's a different question. So that's one way to make a bomb, is to enrich uranium. Another way is to use a nuclear reactor in order to create plutonium. And so plutonium is another product that Iran has currently, and they've agreed to redesign and rebuild the reactor they have. It's at a place called Arak, A-R-A-K, and that reactor, as you know, or as you may know, has been the subject of dispute about what its status is, how well stocked it is, and how able the Iranians are to put it into production. But what they've agreed to do is to keep the core of that reactor in Iran, but take any spent fuel and ship it out of Iran. So they'll take it out of Iran's borders. Now, this is a temporary agreement, though. That's important to note. This is not a permanent agreement that they're always going to have the small amount of centrifuges they pledge, or that they're always going to ship their spent fuel rods out of Iran. It only lasts for 10 years that they're going to do this. After 10 years, they're able to start up the reactor and gain more centrifuges in order to create a much more active, vibrant, and, yes, potential nuclear weaponization capability with their production facilities. So, a plutonium or a uranium-based nuclear weapon is, assuming this agreement is honored and carried through, it's a temporary restriction on the Iranian government about what they will be able to do, only really for the next 10 years. You've heard that there are 15 years, I'm sure, and that applies to some other aspects of what Iran can and cannot do, and I'll talk about those in a moment. So, one of the concerns that came out of this deal was, how's Iran going to pay for what it wants to do? And that comes in the form of what are called sanctions relief. As you may know, the United States itself, under U.S. law, has imposed sanctions on companies based in the United States that seek to do business with Iran. And by the way, most Iranian corporations are partly owned or wholly owned by the Iranian government. And so any U.S.-based company that seeks to do business with an Iranian company needs to either abide by these sanctions or run the risk of having a penalty imposed on it if it does engage with business with Iran. These sanctions under this agreement will be lifted over time. The trigger for lifting the sanctions is whether or not Iran complies with the reductions requirements of the agreement regarding plutonium and uranium. In other words, if they don't cheat, if they don't produce more uranium and higher grades of it, and they don't maintain a reactor that can produce plutonium, if they don't do any of that, then the sanctions will kick in. The sanctions relief will kick in. Now, what does this mean for Iran? Part of the sanctions relief is literally in the form of new money. A lot of money since the late 1970s, since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, has essentially been frozen in U.S. accounts. The estimates vary depending on what types of accounts are included, but it's been anywhere between 100 billion and 150 billion. And amazingly, that is over 1/3 of the GDP of Iran. So that's a lot of money, and it's a huge percentage of Iran's economy that can be freed up in a relatively short amount of time. What will be done with this money? Well, Iran has said that once that money is released to it, it will be able to use it to reinvigorate its domestic economy. Now, its domestic economy, of course, is greatly controlled by the state. And so it will, for example, be able to refurbish oil production facilities. Iran has a great deal of oil resources, natural gas and oil, and it will be able to invest in reproduction and refurbishment of those facilities to allow greater exports. Once that happens, that Iran will also be able to profit from oil sales. That's another part of the sanctions relief, is that oil sales from Iran, in terms of restrictions on quantity of oil and places where they can sell it, will be lifted as part of the sanctions relief as well. Now, of course, Iran doesn't just spend its money domestically. Iran also spends its money in terms of supporting different groups outside of Iran. One of these, of course, is Hezbollah, which is based in both Lebanon and Syria. And Hezbollah is both a political party in Lebanon, but it's also considered a terrorist group. And they have thousands, estimates are, they have thousands of missiles of all different sizes that have been fired over the years at Israel, and that are periodically resupplied through shipments from Iran and some of their proxies in Syria. So Hezbollah is expected to benefit from the sanctions relief under this deal. Also, Hamas, which is based, of course, in Gaza, or it's strongest in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Hamas will also be seen as a beneficiary of Iranian largesse as a result of the sanctions relief, and also other smaller satellite recipients of Iran's largesse, like Islamic Jihad and the Houthis, who are the rebels in Yemen currently against the Yemeni government. So each of these groups are, to differing degrees, supported financially and, in the case of Hezbollah and Hamas, also militarily by Iran and the Revolutionary Guard in particular, which is the elite military unit of the Iranian army. So all of these are expected to be recipients of some of that huge amount of sanctions relief that is part of this deal. Another part of the sanctions relief that's non-monetary is an arms embargo that will be lifted after 5 years. The arms embargo means conventional arms, not nuclear weapons, but rather conventional arms, rockets, jeeps, tanks, all armaments of all different types. These have been forbidden under both U.S. and United Nations sanctions because Iran is seen and has been designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. So armaments have been forbidden to be sold to Iran, but that restriction will be lifted after 5 years under this deal. Also, after 8 years, ballistic missiles, these are the missiles that carry or can carry nuclear explosives, and they're very powerful because they can carry multiple devices to explode on them. And they're not just a one bomb, they can have many bombs on them. Ballistic missile technology is something that Iran has developed over time, over the years, and the embargo on ballistic missile technology will be lifted after 8 years. Now, it's interesting to note that these are part of the deal. In other words, this is part of the sanctions relief in addition to freeing up money for Iran. It's the freeing up of the ability for Iran to buy and sell technology related to conventional arms and ballistic missiles. But recently, the news service Reuters reported that Iran has claimed that it will not abide by any restrictions on imports of conventional or ballistic missile technology under this deal. So Iran is signaling, based on this Reuters report, that it's not going to abide by any restrictions currently anyway. So that 5 and 8 year timeline may not mean that much because they're going to apparently, expressly, openly violate it. Also, Iran's own state-controlled news agency called the Fars News has recently reported that an Air Force general named Amir Hajizadeh said this Saturday, just 2 days ago, that Iran would develop replacements for some of its ballistic missiles as a result of this deal. In other words, this is what it's going to spend some of its money on. And so it's going to develop these ballistic missiles immediately, and they're moving forward with programs that the U.S. and other members of the United Nations have been fearing that they would move forward with covertly. Now they're going to openly do it. So, oil sales, money released from the United States and other European countries that have frozen their assets, arms embargoes lifting in 5 years, and ballistic missiles lifting in 8 years. This is all part of the formal terms of the sanctions relief. You may have also heard about another part of the agreement called the inspections agreement. Now, the inspections that are allowed under this agreement are only inspections of nuclear sites, not military sites. And that can mean a great deal because military sites can be extensive. They can certainly be used to house and shield nuclear production facilities and technology. Nuclear sites are construed by the Iranians as being civilian-oriented. In other words, Iran has always claimed that it has no military use for its nuclear program. It's purely civilian. That is, it is a source of domestic power generation. Now, this has been the source of contention between Iran and the West. The West hasn't believed that this is the purpose of Iran's nuclear program. So part of the negotiation was to obtain as much access as possible, but all that Iran has consented to in the agreement is the designated civilian sites rather than any of its military bases. Now, for those civilian sites, let's keep in mind that the military sites are off limits under the deal. Those civilian sites that have been identified, when an inspection is desired on the part of Western inspectors, and those Western inspectors, by the way, are not U.S. inspectors. There will be no U.S. citizens that are part of the inspection regime. In other words, the inspections are done entirely out of Vienna, Austria, with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that is part of the United Nations. It's based in Vienna, not in New York. And experts on nuclear technology will come from that agency in Vienna to go to Iran to inspect. What will they be inspecting? Again, civilian sites, and when they wish to inspect, they will only have there will be a window of time during which they cannot inspect, which is 24 days. So, if they want to inspect a particular site, they have to ask the Iranians if we can go to that site to inspect it, and the Iranians get 24 days before the inspectors come. Obviously, there's a concern that much can happen within 24 days. You can imagine what could happen if you order the military to do something in 24 hours. So 24 days, a lot can happen, and a lot actually has already happened. There's been a lot of satellite imagery from some of the known nuclear sites like Natanz, where there has been bulldozer activity and laying of new roads and demolishing or razing of buildings. All of this is supposedly civilian in origin or in character, according to the Iranian government, but we already have a lot of activity at these sites before inspections have even been requested. So, this so-called 24-day rule is actually a product of what's called a side deal. You may have heard of the side deals that aren't part of the actual negotiation between the U.S. or the P5+1 and Iran. It's actually a so-called side deal between Iran and the nuclear agency in Vienna. That side deal is where we get this 24 days. Another aspect of this side deal, in addition to the 24-day time period that just came out this weekend or late last week, is that all of the soil samples that the IAEA will be investigating to determine whether or not there's any radioactivity in the soil is going to be procured by the Iranian government itself. And so it won't be the product of someone from the IAEA or the United Nations going to Iran to get a soil sample, but rather it will be soil that's supposedly taken from the site that's being requested to be investigated, brought to Vienna, Austria for testing. Obviously there's an issue of trust and whether or not you can really verify anything, because who knows where the soil came from. So there are a lot of concerns about this inspections agreement and whether or not it's really going to be effective. Now, you may have also heard about something called breakout time. Breakout time is the ability of the Iranian regime to take its nuclear technology, and I think it's over here somewhere, and take its nuclear technology and actually move from not having a weapon to openly having a weapon. It's currently estimated anywhere between a month to 3 months that Iran has right now in terms of its ability to create a weapon. The whole premise of this agreement is to extend the breakout time to a year. That is, if Iran cheats under the agreement, their breakout time should have been extended to a year if they've already complied with the reduction parts of the agreement that I mentioned earlier. In other words, if they ship all of that spent fuel out of the country, if they don't have any more centrifuges in action that they've pledged under the agreement, then that extends the so-called breakout time to create a nuclear weapon from a few months to a year, ostensibly giving the West time to either negotiate or prepare a military response. Now, this of course depends upon compliance with the agreement. It's important to note that all of the reductions that I've mentioned and the inspections and the staggering timetable on relief from sanctions, this is all within a 10 to 15 year period. In other words, if this agreement is implemented as it's envisioned and Iran complies with everything that they've said they will do, all of the restrictions on Iran will only last for 15 years. In other words, if everything goes as planned, 15 years from now, all of the restrictions come off and Iran can do anything it wants.
That's a very
Ostensibly.
short period of time.
It is. It goes by in the blink of an eye, it seems. And so 15 years from now, the Iranian government, whatever its character is, if it's still the same type of government that it is today or if it's something different, doesn't matter, under this agreement, that government will be free to enrich uranium with as many centrifuges as it wants, create a nuclear military program if it desires, build and activate as many reactors as it wants and produce its own fuel, and it does not have to ship it out anymore. And so after 15 years, this agreement envisions that Iran really will be free to do what it wants. Now, that's the basics of the agreement. What is it that the U.S. envisions? The administration, the Obama administration, this agreement was negotiated by Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, and those are the lead negotiators, and they have supported, promoted this agreement as the best deal that the United States and the other members of the Western Security Council could get absent war. In other words, the support for this agreement has been characterized as a choice between this agreement, albeit imperfect, or war. Nothing in between. The critics of the agreement argue that that is a false choice or a false dichotomy, and that there are more choices that could be, or different routes that could be taken in order to get either a better agreement or better behavior under the ongoing current sanctions regime against Iran. So the opposition to this deal includes, as I'm sure you are well aware, the current Israeli government. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that this is a historic mistake. The Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, has been lobbying members of the U.S. Senate and the Congress to vote against this deal. In September, there will be a congressional vote, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The New York Senator Charles Schumer, or Chuck Schumer, has come out, most notably, he's essentially the highest-ranking Democratic member of the Democratic side to come out against this agreement. His reason is that he does not think that this agreement will result in a change in the Iranian regime. In other words, one of the arguments in favor of this that the administration has made is that we don't know what the character of Iran will be in 15 years, which is true. We don't know. Schumer's response, however, is that this agreement will do nothing to help change that character, that it in fact will strengthen the current regime and allow it to maintain a greater hold on Iranian government and society. Again, we don't know who's right. We don't know for certain, that is, and I'm sure you all have opinions on who's right.
Oh, yes.
But I'm trying to present both sides here. and so that we understand how each side views this. So, Senator Schumer has been joined by several members of the New York delegation, Eliot Engel, Nita Lowey, Stephen Israel, Grace Meng, Kathleen Rice. All of these are representatives from populations in their districts that have high numbers of Jewish residents in their districts. All of these have come out against the deal negotiated. As you may know, Gerald Nadler is the one House member who is Jewish himself who has come out in favor of the deal. So at this point, many Democrats have not proclaimed what they're going to do publicly. And the question is whether or not there will be a sufficient number of Democrats to join with Republicans to vote against this deal when the vote is taken in September. And so toward that end, there has been lobbying on both sides by outside groups to try to persuade members, mostly Democrats, that is, who have not declared their position, to vote both against and for this. For example, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has vehemently come out against this deal, and they are lobbying members of Congress with their extensive financial support in an effort to try to persuade them to vote against this deal in September. Similarly, J Street, which is a group formed in 2008, AIPAC's been around for decades, since the 1970s, I believe, but J Street's been around only since 2008, and that is a group that supports this deal. They are similarly lobbying Democratic members to argue that they should vote in favor of it. There's a group called Citizens for a Nuclear-Free Iran. They have spent upwards of $40 million against this deal. They're lobbying and buying advertising to try to persuade members of Congress to vote against it. Now, it's important to understand that this deal is not being presented to Congress as a treaty. Normally, when the executive branch of the U.S. government negotiates with a foreign government and makes an agreement that needs to be supported by domestic American law, it has to be presented as a treaty to be ratified by the Senate. But in this case, presumably because President Obama realized that this treaty, if it were presented as a treaty, that this deal would not be approved, he has decided that he's not going to even attempt to present it to the Congress. Rather, he's going to construe it just as an executive agreement with another executive. Now, whether that is a constitutional act on President Obama's part is debatable. The argument in favor of having it presented to the Congress is that this is a very important agreement. It deals with national security. It deals with a known terrorist-supporting state, and it's also a state that has pledged to destroy one of our key allies in the world, Israel, and therefore it should be, because of its importance and its monumental character, it ought to be presented for the legislature to treat as a treaty. But it has not been, and it will not be. Now, what happened earlier in the late in the spring, earlier in the summer, is that the Congress did something rather unusual. They essentially voted to require that Congress will pass judgment on this treaty, but they flipped the result. In other words, normally an agreement won't go into effect unless Congress approves it. That's what the treaty is, right? You have to make an agreement, and then Congress either approves it or it doesn't, and if Congress doesn't approve it, it won't go into effect. What Congress did, however, in order to persuade the administration to present as much information to Congress as possible, in order for it to intelligently debate whether or not to approve this, was to agree that the agreement will go into effect unless Congress disapproves it. Now that might sound like 6, 1/2 dozen and the other, but it's not, because essentially now all that's needed in order to disapprove the agreement, or excuse me, in order for the agreement to go forward,